Welcome to another episode of the Animal Liberation Hour, where we seek insight from animal rights and liberation activists around the world so that we can think, reflect, learn, and be inspired. Have you ever tried to outreach to someone that is a Christian and they use every excuse in the book? Or maybe you are a Christian and you haven't been accepted by your Christian community ever since you've gone vegan or since you've become an animal rights activist. Today we're going to be talking to Matthew A. King. He is the author of I Will Abolish the Bow, Christianity, Personhood, and the End of Animal Exploitation. He's also the co-founder of the Christian Animal Rights Association. Matthew has a ton of knowledge about Christianity and how it interweaves with veganism and animal rights. So whether you're a Christian who needs help convincing other Christians that they should be vegan, or maybe you're not a Christian, but you have Christian friends and family that you're trying to convince to go vegan or become involved in animal rights, this is the podcast episode for you. And I think you'll find Matthew to be extremely knowledgeable on these topics, and I'm sure everybody will take something away from this that they can use. But before we get into the episode, I want to remind you that the Animal Liberation Hour is a project of Animal Activism Mentorship. AAM is a free multinational program that helps aspiring animal rights activists, as well as those who are already activists but want to take their activism to the next level. From one-on-one mentorship to free workshops and trainings to this podcast, AAM seeks to empower humans to fight for animals so that the world will have more activists and we can achieve liberation sooner. For more information, visit our website at animalactivismmentorship.com and follow AAM on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship. You can keep up with the Animal Liberation Hour on AAM's social media too. Animal Activism Mentorship is fueled by Farm Animal Rights Movement. Again, Matthew has so much knowledge on Christianity and veganism. I'm so happy to be able to share his knowledge with you in this episode, and I hope that you enjoy. Welcome everybody to another episode of the Animal Liberation Hour. Today I have in the background my dog Wally, who is a little anxious right now, so forgive me for that. But I also have our very special guest, Matthew A. King. What's up, Matthew?
Hey, Trey, thanks for having me, man. And Wally, of course. He's the real guest.
Yeah, his sisters are outside right now, so he's a little bit anxious, so he's hanging in here with me. But so you're a Christian and you're a vegan. I was wondering, were you a Christian first or a vegan first?
Well, I guess, in America, I think everybody's sort of a Christian at a young age. Like I was raised, my mom was Catholic, my dad was Lutheran. They were both raised in the church, but they were never real strict about it or anything. And I have kind of a strange scenario in the church too, because I was baptized Lutheran, but I was confirmed Catholic. And so like my parents would like take me to church, but I don't really think they knew anything about it either. It was just sort of a family obligation. Like my grandma was like, oh, they have to make sure that they go to church and they go to, you're familiar with maybe CCD, like where they do like the educational classes and stuff like that. I did all that. It never really made any sense to me at all. Like I when I was younger, I understood, the way I understood Christianity was just, Jesus was this really ethical guy, and you have to try to be ethical like him, and then we'll try to make the world better through that. And that was sort of my understanding growing up. I didn't know anything really beyond that. And then when I hit like college, I started to become more atheistic. I was more, I'm a nurse in my private life, and so I studied science. I studied the biology, chemistry, and everything else. And starting to look at that, it's like, well, when you study evolution, when you study all these different things, this sort of debunks religion in all of its forms, sort of. And then I was kind of like a weak atheist until probably about 2015. And then I started going back to church a little bit more. I started to have bouts of depression, anxiety, things like that. I started to look more into world religions and things like that. And I started to study a lot of Christianity, and it started to give me a sense of peace about death and a lot of different things like that. And then, so you could say I was sort of Christian first. And then my wife, actually, I think it was probably about 2014, actually, she started looking into vegetarianism. Because actually, I love to tell this story. My wife actually became vegetarian first because we're both nurses, and she was working at the hospital on a late shift. It was like a 16-hour. And she worked like 12 hours. They asked her to stay for a 16, so she did. So she's driving back at like 11 o'clock at night, and she's driving through this one really windy road that was by our old house. And it had like a deer crossing sign, like, be watchful for deer. And it was a notoriously difficult road, especially at night. There would always be deer there, still is. And she's driving, and, she's like slapping herself awake. Didn't see any deer, but she went back home, made it home safe. And she went into bed, and then the next morning she wakes up, and she was like, I had this terrible, terrible nightmare. And I was like, oh, really? Like, you don't usually have that. What happened? And she was like, well, I dreamed that I was driving, and then I hit this deer and I slaughtered him, because I put him out of his misery. And right before I did it, the deer said, if you're going to eat me, you might as well eat your dog too. And she had this like really crazy dream. And after that, she was like, yeah, I can never eat meat again. There's no way.
That's crazy.
Right. I love to tell the story too, because it's just such a unique way of, usually someone's like, I watched a documentary and that was it. And Nina's is so unique.
Yeah, definitely. Hey, in the Bible, God communicated with people through, like dreams and visions all the time. So
I've thought about that too. Actually, we've discussed that. Like, maybe it was a divine intervention, certainly, and certainly what it led to. That's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting.
Right. I love to tell that story actually, because you always get the best reactions. But and then after that, she was vegetarian for like 2 months, and I was a punk about it. I was like 24. I was sort of like, oh, vegetarian, whatever. Like I don't need to listen to this. I'm a man. All the cognitive dissonance and everything that went into it. And so then I had a similar experience, probably like within the same year, I would say. It was I was watching this movie called Southern Comfort. I don't know if you ever heard of it. Takes place in New Orleans, but it has like it's sort of like a Deliverance knockoff, if you're familiar with Deliverance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're down in New Orleans, and these soldiers are like messing with these local guys, and the local guys get fed up, and they actually kidnap the soldiers, and they take them back to their village. And so then in the village, they actually have a pig roast, and they killed these pigs, and I was like, that has to be real. Like, there's no way that was fake in any way, shape, or form. And I looked it up online in like the trivia section, and it said that the director, he was actually with like these New Orleans locals, and they were like, yeah, we're having a pig roast today. And he's like, you know what? I actually want to catch that on footage because it'll make the movie scarier. And so everything was real. I mean, they showed the pigs getting shot in the head, and then they skinned them, and then they put their organs out, they gutted them, and then, the whole graphic nature of it. And I watched that, and I was like, I actually can't eat meat ever again. Like, that was so disturbing that I was like, I can't possibly look at meat ever again and not think of that scene. And so that started that. And then like shortly after that, I had ordered chicken wings at a local bar, and I had always gotten chicken wings there like pretty frequently. And I was eating it, and I was like, and this is we got a dog in 2013 actually, Ripley. We still have him. He just turned 9 actually, and he's like my best buddy. Me and him, we really bonded, and he actually changed my whole perspective on animals. But I was eating chicken wings, and I was feeling them, and like they tasted fine and everything, and then I started feeling them, and I was like, this feels so much like my dog's bones. Like, this is really, really weird. Like, I felt the chicken wing, and I was like, this feels like my dog's leg, and it really bothered me. So then after that, I couldn't eat meat ever again. I did do pescatarian because that's the only meat that I could eat that it didn't bother me. Like, or I was like, this is like so much disconnected from an animal that I don't really feel like I can feel like it's meat. And so I continued like pescatarian for like a year or so before like going vegetarian. But back to the dog perspective too. That was another thing that really changed both of our perspectives really. Because when I was growing up, my parents are antique furniture collectors actually. So like having animals in the house, that was always like a big no-no. That was like, I'd ask my parents for like a dog, and they like would just laugh. Yeah, especially, but my dad had like dogs growing up. My mom didn't, but I always had this perspective on animals that they were sort of like machines. Like I talk about in my book actually about like Rene Descartes. He always said that animals were just machines, and they just did, they just lived by instinct. And I always thought the same thing actually. I just always thought that like, well, they just live, they poop, they eat, and then repeat. And I didn't think that they had like emotions or feelings or anything like that. And then Ripley, it totally changed my perspective on things because my wife he's a Shetland sheepdog, actually, and she brought him home. And I didn't really have any sort of understanding about how to raise a dog. And like I said, she would work night shifts and day shifts. So I was basically stuck raising this dog. And it was a good experience overall. It taught me a lot. But some of the things that really amazed me, actually, because I just had no idea. But when I would feed him every day. She would buy these food packages. And it was like peas and carrots and like some sort of meat that would go together. It was like those Caesar foods. And I would open one up. I would give it to Rip. And then he would eat it. I would take the dish, and he had peas at the bottom of the dish. And I was like, "Well, that's strange. Like, why would the peas? Like, maybe they're just they're not jiving with the system or something. Maybe he feels sick after he eats them. I don't know." So then the one day I was looking, and he was actually spitting out the peas, and I was like, "That is bizarre." I was like, "Why would a?" And then you start to think subconsciously, why would a machine spit out the peas? Like, he had to have had a preference. Yeah. And that's what made me think. And I was like, well, I don't like Brussels sprouts. That's probably how he feels about the peas. And so that just totally changed my perspective. And then there were some other moments too. And I was like, I started to see the personality behind animals. And that seeded my idea as well. And then if you want to hear more, I can tell you about the how we went vegan, actually, is also a good story.
Yeah.
So my wife continued vegetarian until I think it was late 2016, like August 2016, I think it was. And she was watching Earthlings, of course, the famous Earthlings. And she's watching it. I'm in my office, and she's watching it. And she comes back an hour and a half later or whatever. She was like, yeah, I think I have to go vegan because vegetarianism is just not enough. I watched how goats and chickens get treated within dairy and the egg industries. And I just cannot do vegetarian anymore. I have to be vegan. And I was like, oh, you're crazy. This is nuts. How could you ever, vegans are crazy. Vegetarian I'm cool with, but vegans are just one step too far. And I had all these preconceived notions of what veganism was. And I was like, this is nuts. You're taking things too far. I'm like, and so then she posed a question to me, and she was like, well, how about this? If you won't at least hear me out, will you watch the movie? So then I stormed off into my office. I'm like, I don't have to listen to this. Whatever. I don't need to hear this. Whatever. So I put my feet up on my desk, and I'm on my computer, and I'm huffing and puffing and whatever. And then I was I settled down finally. I was like, probably what's going to happen. I'm about 99% sure that I'm going to watch Earthlings. I'm going to see what happens. I'm also going to go vegan.
It's a scary thought, man. It's a scary thought.
Exactly. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to skip all of that hour and a half of snuff film and just go vegan. And so I told.
Wow.
Yep. So I came back 20 minutes later. After huffing and puffing in my office, I was like, all right, look, I will try veganism out with you. I understand, what you're saying. I'll try it out with you if that's the least I can do. Because as long as you don't make me watch that movie, that's fine. I'll do it.
That's really interesting because I don't think I've ever heard somebody tell me they went vegan because they didn't want to have to see what the animals went through, because what was in your imagination was already bad enough.
Right. And that's what it is too, is I watched that pig footage from Southern Comfort, and that's all that it took for me to even be vegetarian, because I knew if I watched the movie, I would be like, I'm repulsed by eggs and milk now. There's no way I can eat it. So let's just skip all that footage.
Yeah, definitely, dude. Oh man. Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I've actually never watched Dominion or Earthlings, I've seen clips of those movies, of course, just from street activism and that kind of stuff's on the TVs, and oh my goodness, I see it in my Facebook feed and Instagram feed, all the time. So I've definitely seen my fair share of the footage, but I've never just that. There's one time I was at an animal rights event, and they showed Gary Yourofsky's speech, and he's got that little maybe 5-minute section of animal abuse, in the middle of that speech, or maybe toward the end. And when I watched that online, right after I went vegan, I would just skip through that part. But I was at this event and I couldn't skip through it, and oh man, it was just I'm just curling my knuckles, I can't take it, it's just, man, it's just so brutal to watch. And of course, if you're an empathetic person, you're thinking, it's so much worse to be in their position than to have to watch it. And yeah, to go back to what you said about dogs and, like animals are individuals, I have 4 dogs and, I've been a vegan for over 5 years, and, I know that animals are individuals. I mean, I know that I've, for that very reason, I'm fighting every day that I can. But still, my dogs do things that just like take me off guard and surprise me, because the more you get to know an animal, the more, you realize really just, I mean, there's just more and more nuances that you discover about, their identity and their traits and everything. Yeah, it's so beautiful to just, the more and more we understand that, the more beautiful it is. But I wanted to ask you, because a lot of people have kind of mixed reactions about Christianity and veganism together. So I wanted to ask you, you said you were kind of like an atheist before going Christian. Now, when you went vegan, did that make your faith waver at all, or did it strengthen your faith?
The Christian faith and the veganism, they always sort of went together for me, because they were both sort of like these epochs in time where I started to change a lot of different perspectives of myself. Like, for instance, the atheism went to Christianity, like, between 2015, somewhere in there. And then the veganism came like 2014. So it was all sort of together at all times. And it really changed the way I looked at things. But I started reading, of course I started looking up, like, what does the Bible have to say about veganism? And that leads you to, especially with a lot of the mainstream Christian websites, Romans 14, it's this, don't judge the one who eats, the one who abstains, shouldn't judge the person who eats meat, and all these different things. And then, you're reading about, Jesus ate fish. And so I'm automatically, I was like, wow, this book is really, really not animal friendly at all. But then when I started digging a little harder, I started to, I think the first exposure I ever had with Christianity and animal related stuff was Andrew Lindsay. You probably know I'm a fan of his. He's really been helpful as far as that, like linking that idea that like Christianity has a lot to say about animals actually, and a lot to the positive. And it goes back to that whole slavery issue too, where it's like, well, if you read stuff back from, the mid 1800s, 1850s, before abolition of slavery in 1865, there was a lot of Christians that said, well, it's, slavery is acceptable. It's not, the Bible okays it. But then there was also a lot of Christians that said, well, no, this isn't okay. And, this is a different hermeneutic than what you're reading it as, or a different interpretation. And Andrew Lindsay really opened up my eyes about, it's like the Garden of Eden. I remember reading, because not many churches really put an emphasis on that too. Because, I always say that the Bible has a lot to say about veganism. It's the beginning and the end. I mean, that's 2 major moments in history that's the most important thing. I mean, it's the second thing God tells humans. His first one is reproduce. The second one is eat only plants. And so it's, it's right in the pages of the Bible, and we just skip over that and think nothing of it as Christians. Like, God just tells us to eat plants, whatever. But it's like, no, the significance of that, in Genesis 1:29, he says, eat plants only. And then Genesis 1:31, he says, this is very good. And so obviously it's the ideal. And then you fast forward to the end of time, Isaiah 11:6-9. The wolf is laying with the lamb. The children are taking care of all of the animals. Everybody's vegan again. And so, and then Jesus said, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so, Christianity can be a very good resource for veganism. And it has a lot of great arguments for why we should take care of animals, or why we should, I say, serve them rather than exploit them.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like, people often really just judge Christianity based on other so-called Christians and other people, and things that happened in history that God didn't necessarily approve of, that was done in the name of Christianity. I mean, there's so many things when it comes to that, and in the Old Testament especially, I mean, there's a lot of wording, that like words just don't mean the same things as they do now, and it just comes off a certain way, and you really kind of got to dig into some of this language and dig into some of the meanings of these verses to truly understand it. But yeah, so I've heard of people giving up their faith in Christ once they go vegan, and maybe maybe some of that is because of like kind of what I just said. I mean, I've been reading the Bible, and I'm in the Old Testament right now, and it's brutal, man. It's brutal toward animals. Maybe that's why. Maybe that's why that happens. I don't know. Do you think you have an idea of why sometimes people stop being a Christian once they go vegan?
I've heard that a lot actually too. I know when we go to like expo events or veg fests, things like that, we'll talk to people and they'll come up to my table and they'll be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you guys exist," because I try to tell my family about how I watched this documentary and how I want to be vegan now. And they would automatically hit them with, well, Jesus ate meat. Well, the Bible says you have to eat meat. Dominion means we can do whatever we want to animals. And so, they're discouraged right off the bat from a lot of Christian thinking, and Christianity too has become sort of intertwined with the culture as well. There's a lot of things that Christians believe about animals that are not in the Bible at all. I mean, and that's something that I'm facing all the time. I mean, I've had many people tell me, "Oh, well, dominion means that we can just do whatever we want to animals," or dominion means that we can just eat them and not care, and we can be ruthless and tyrannical. And there's so many things that are taken out of context. And then there's also the most persistent one is God made animals to eat, and I don't know where that came from. There's nothing in the Bible that says that. That doesn't even make any sense logically. It's like the Bible, has a pretty clear answer on that.
Yeah, I mean, you can argue that God gave permission, but I don't think you can really argue that He created them specifically to eat, because just like you said in Genesis 1:29, it says the plants are here to eat. It doesn't say anything about eating animals.
Right. Yeah, and actually, the animals were designed to be friends. Like I always talk about how Genesis 2:19-20, Adam he's asked to name the animals. And so what did God have in mind with that? It was like, well, obviously, if you look in other pages of the Bible, like when does God name others? Like Jesus named Peter. Jesus wasn't eating Peter. He was treating Peter as a friend. And it's this, you have this significance of naming means a lot more than what we think it means. Like I used to read that and I used to think like, oh, well, Adam was naming them like horse or pig or like, by their species or something. And then the traditional Hebrew of that actually is that no, he was actually naming them like Bob, Ripley, John. He was naming them actual names that he called them because they were his friends. That was the intention all along.
Oh, I've never thought of that. I always thought just the species. Yeah, I never thought about like giving individual names. Yeah, I never even thought of that.
Yeah, a lot of people say that actually. Yeah, when I think it's one of those things where our culture gets laced up in it. Like for instance, we read that and it says, "Oh, you're naming the animals." We think that he's like, Linnaeus naming them by species. It's like, no, they had no concept of that back in biblical times. They had no idea. They would just say this type of animal or, this cow or, they didn't have like specific Latin species names, And that was the other thing was the traditional Hebrew understanding of that was he was naming them because they were his friends. And that's sort of like God names Abram, Abraham. He names Sarai, Sarah. It's this sort of, you're my friend, you have significance beyond food, obviously.
Yeah, definitely. And going along that theme, so for those that don't know, I'm a Christian myself, and, I stopped going to church many years ago before I ever went vegan, mostly because I couldn't find a church where I felt comfortable or where I shared, like, similar views and values with the other people there. Like for example, I went to this one church for years, and people were just like fighting behind the scenes, and I was like, I got to get out of here. I went to another church, and everything was going okay there, but then I was in like the youth group or whatever, and somebody asked the youth pastor, what would we do if a gay person came to church? And the youth pastor said, well, we'd ask him to leave. So I was like, okay, I'm leaving this church too. Man. Yeah, I just couldn't find a place where I felt comfortable. And then I also, a little bit later, that was like when I was a teenager. And then a little bit later in life, I couldn't find a place because I always felt judged on like my tattoos and piercings and even having a long hair and beard, which I'm pretty sure that's the look that Jesus rocked. So I never understood that. But anyway, but because of all that, I didn't experience what it was like to become a vegan while being an active member in a church and really having like a Christian community. So as I just kind of mentioned, like in my experience, Christians are some of the most judgmental people I've ever encountered, honestly. And I say all that to ask what advice you might have for someone who does go vegan that's already in the Christian community, or somebody who's newly vegan or thinking of going vegan, because I can only imagine the fear of the pushback and judgment from their fellow Christians. I just wondered if you have any advice for those folks.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I was sort of in that. I mean, I was, like I said, my Christian and veganism have sort of been intertwined. And so I can remember feeling like, oh man, like the Bible's like really not pro animal rights at all. And, how do you feel whole with that? And I can remember, trying to seek like-minded individuals. I think that's the most important thing. Like I found, Christian Vegetarian Association. That was a really big resource for me, just to read some of their stuff online and to see that other people were talking about it. That was really helpful. And then it's also, there's a lot of authors that write about it too. I mean, I can remember, I got them right here actually. Andrew Lindsay, obviously, Matthew Scully. I read his book Dominion. And then also, even like, there's a lot of non-Christian publications also that are just really helpful. And, it'll make you feel like at least, there's not, there's a lot of people that are talking about it. It's not just, the majority might not be, but there is a pocket of people that you can feel comfortable with. And I think that's important, and to seek solidarity in that. And they might not find people in the church that are like that, but there are people in the churches that are raising questions. And even since I've started activism for animals, I mean, I think there's probably 4 or 5 major organizations that are Christian organizations that are dedicated to animal rights, not just even animal welfare. I mean, I know there was one that just popped up a couple months ago, Creation Care Church. They've been doing really great work. And then Christian Veg, obviously, allcreatures.org, Frank Hoffman runs.
Allcreatures.org was so helpful for me. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, he's really great. He's got a whole like curation of different things from the 80s, I think, from all these different publications. And there's also Creature Kind. They're a really great organization. They focused on a lot of animal related things, and they'll definitely, if you reach out to someone from them, they'll definitely understand how you feel.
Man, imagine being a Christian vegan in the 80s, dude.
Oh yeah, that's right. And yeah, especially because there was probably, you just had to eat salad. There was no real other options.
Yeah, just being a vegan in the 80s, but then being like a Christian vegan in the 80s. Yeah. You probably don't even know the word vegan yet.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's actually amazing too, because a lot of church people don't even know the word vegan too. I mean, I remember I went to a church group one time and they were like, this is no joke actually. I forgot to tell this story. We brought a potluck. It was like, we take a round robin, and everybody at this Bible study would bring an item. And so my wife was like, hey, let's bring a cake to them. And so we didn't even question it. It was a vegan cake. So we brought it and we gave it to the people, and 2 people knew. I was like, yeah, it was a vegan vanilla cake. And the 2 younger people, I think they were like probably Gen X to millennial in that age group. They were like, oh yeah, this is great. Really good cake. And the one guy is an older guy. He's like, what kind of cake? And we're like, it's vegan. He's like, is that a spice? It took everything inside of us not to laugh at it, but it was like, oh man, we got a long road.
Oh yeah, I remember being at work one time, and I was talking about like, cauliflower chicken or something like that, and some older dude was like, you can't make chicken out of no damn cauliflower or something like that. And I'm like, oh dude, come on man. Don't be that guy.
He was that guy.
He was that guy. So how do you specifically handle pushback from your fellow Christians about your veganism? Does that ever come up?
It has a few times. I know. I'm trying to think. I did an activism event actually with a local organization, and we did this big thing. It was a cube, and you have the TV out, and then it's showing animal cruelty, and people respond to it. And I had this one Christian come up to me. They're typically not Christians. I've very rarely had Christians come up to me, but usually if they do, I'll be in the group and they'll come up to somebody in the group and they'll be like, hey, Matt, this guy's a Christian, deal with this guy. So it's sort of like that, but it's very rare. But the times I had one guy so unbelievably callous, but he was like, what does your organization do for the unborn? And I was like, well, I mean, we're an animal rights organization, and I can't speak for the organization, but I would say and I tried to address his concerns and where there's overlap between pro-life and animal rights. And then he was like, yeah, actually I follow PETA. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Well, it sounds like you're already on the path. He's like, yeah, people eating tasty animals. And I was like, and see, that's what I'm talking about, is that sort of Christian callousness where it's like, okay, you came to me full of steam going on about abortion. And then, he becomes the enemy with the animal rights thing. And it's like, he doesn't even see the overlap between that.
It's really bizarre because one time I had a similar experience. I was at an outreach event like that, and a lot of times people grab me if somebody, is a Christian or something too. And I was talking to this couple, this was a couple years ago, and I was explaining to them about, basically the arguments for, God created these creatures, he's entrusted us with this responsibility, they're vulnerable, so it's our duty to take care of them, blah, blah, blah. And they just did not care. They said, we only care about humans. And I said, okay, well, did you know that, eating animals is like killing people? Did you know that the people that work in slaughterhouses are so vulnerable and they suffer from higher rates of PTSD and depression and substance abuse and domestic violence and, all this stuff. And they literally looked me in the face and said, we don't care. And I was like, so you don't care about humans? You don't care about animals? You don't care about anything? How are you even a Christian? How do you even claim to be a Christian if you don't care about other people even?
Yep. Yep. That's usually where, and that was, you did a good job of exposing that too, because a lot of people come on strong and say, my compassion ends where animals start, or, where humans end. And that's usually the kicker, is you'll tell them like, well, animal agriculture is devastating towards climate change, towards workers. I mean, you can go on and on and on about the devastating effects on humans. And then suddenly they start backing up and they're like, well, here comes the Bible.
Yeah, exactly. I just thought of this. This is a little bit off topic, but I just we were talking about animal sacrifice and stuff earlier. I just thought of this time I was at a college, and I was with Vegan Outreach doing some leafleting, and there was this guy there. He was kind of like a street preacher guy. I'm sure everybody's come across a street preacher if you live in the South or maybe even elsewhere. But he was just out in the street with his Bible, preaching at people about different things. And I talked to him for a little bit, told him I was a Christian, what I was there doing, and, kind of the whole bit that I told that, couple that came up. And he was talking about animal sacrifice, but then, he said something to me that I haven't forgotten, and this was several years ago. But he said, if animals didn't have any significance, then, they wouldn't have been sacrificed. Maybe that's why what God was trying to do is show people the true consequences of their sin, because animals are important. And of course, we'd never condone animal sacrifice today, and I think there's a lot more to dig into with animal sacrifice. I don't think that was God's ideal. I don't even really think that's what God wanted. I kind of think that he was working within their culture to kind of make them understand, because there was pagan culture back then, and that was kind of their language, so to speak. There's a lot more to dive into on that we probably don't have time for, but it made sense to me what he said. The animals mean something, we're not sacrificing, like a leaf off of a tree or something,
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah. And what you were saying too, that understanding of dealing with their culture, that was the Jewish rabbinical understanding of that too, is that I think it was Maimonides. He was a famous rabbi, and he talked about, that was his explanation for animal sacrifice, was that, they had come from these different cultures, and that's how they knew how to worship God. So God was dealing with it at that time. I actually use the animal sacrifice argument, and I was hoping we'd talk about this actually, because I have another book coming out in 2023. It was actually, the title right now tentatively is Pride Goes Before Destruction, Human Vanity, Animal Agriculture, and the New Covenant Solution. And Whip and Stalk is publishing it. They think it's probably sometime in summer of 2023 is the plan right now. But I have a big section on that actually because I came to the same conclusion as that pastor did because I was thinking, when you look at equality between humans and animals, it's expressed the best actually in animal sacrifice because the whole idea was that, and Hebrews explains this, book of Hebrews, it's that human, because they sinned, they were supposed to die. That's in Romans it says the wages of sin is death. So the cost of sin is death. If you sin, you're supposed to die. And so instead of that person dying, they were supposed to sacrifice an animal. And so, there's nothing in the Bible that says, well, God was satisfied with a lesser sacrifice. Obviously, humans and animals would have to be equivalently equal if God was accepting the animal as a sacrifice in place of the human. And so that was sort of the indication. There's this inherent equality between humans and animals. And also, I think you read my last book, I Will Abolish the Bow. I talked about the equality between humans and animals based on the nefesh. There's that Hebrew word. It means I kind of narrowed it down to it means person, and that's how it's used in the Bible in different places. But it's funny because there's some discrimination in translation. Like for instance, in Genesis 1:20 through I think it's 25, and then Genesis 1:30, and then Genesis 2:19 to 20, when it describes the animals, it says God says, "I declare you nefesh haya." He grants them this personhood. And then it's translated, he says, God created living creatures. It's not translated that way. But then when you get to Adam, it says God created a living person. Even though it's the same word, why is it translated differently?
Something I just thought of too when you were saying that about the animal being the equivalent of like a human as far as the wages of sin being death or whatever. Mm-hmm. Obviously God thought really highly of Jesus, and Jesus was a human sacrifice. So not trying to put like anybody on the same level as Jesus or anything, but I'm just saying the innocence, the clean heart, animals are totally innocent and you could argue sinless. Just like Jesus. So, there's ways in which, you can argue that sort of makes sense. Obviously it's horrible to think about animals bearing the punishment for something that humans did, but obviously that was a really, really long time ago too.
And it's over now. That's the other thing I try to say too is, Jesus was the last sacrifice. And then, like you were saying too, that was animal, or Jesus was the unblemished lamb. That was sort of the focus of his sacrifice. He was just like an animal, and it was required an unblemished lamb. And then, he's the Lamb of God. And that's the whole focus too, is that obviously I identified with that, that comparison, and then he said also, another thing I gathered a lot of controversy actually from a lot of outside sources, but I didn't think it was a stretch at all. But it's like in John 10:11, Jesus says, I lay down my life for the sheep. Now in context, he's obviously talking about, the humans are the sheep, and he's laying down his life for salvation. But if you look at it from a broader perspective, obviously, it means animals, because Hebrews 10:18, there's no more sacrifice for sin required. So he stopped the sacrificial system right there. And so that obviously, just by logic, he laid down his life for the sheep.
Yeah, I've never thought about that. Here's a question for you, going off one of the last questions. So we talked about like pushback from other Christians. Have you ever received any pushback from a vegan or a fellow animal rights activist about your Christianity?
Not as much, actually. Usually, surprisingly, it's the Christians that are usually usually hostile. Not usually hostile, but sometimes hostile.
I don't think I've ever received any like direct hate or anything like that, but I've definitely seen some posts online from just fellow animal rights activists, because I don't know what it is about Christianity, man, but people kind of feel like they can openly mock it and be, it's everything's fine or something. I don't understand it. I mean, I don't really take it super personally as a sign of disrespect or anything, because like, some of the people who post these things, I know they're like good people.
Yeah, and I think it also comes from too, like to be sympathetic. I think I know what you mean, but it's I think it might be too that Christian teachings, especially like throughout history, not all, obviously, this is a generalization, but they've been very hurtful towards a lot of people too. And I think that's something that's important to remember is that, it's like I've done a lot of history reading, and the way that Christianity, I shouldn't say Christianity, the way that the Bible has been interpreted has been very standing in the way of progress. And I think and a lot of times that's the hearts of the believers too. And they cling to biblical teachings that feel comfortable instead of something that is righteous. And even though it can be interpreted differently, they don't like that interpretation because Christianity has become sort of aligned with politics. That's a sort of another aspect that's very problematic. I think going off of what you said too, people that give us grief. There was one guy at a Veg Fest recently, and he was like, he came up to us, and I'm this is not an endorsement of politics in any way, left or right. It's just what happened. But he was like, "Oh, you guys are probably Trumpers," and like, "Oh, you guys are like evangelical," and like, you guys probably all vote Trump. And we're like, "Dude, like, nothing about politics here. Nothing. We're not endorsing anybody. We're not saying that we vote for anybody. We're not bringing politics into it at all." And I think politics has become so entwined with Christianity as well, and that the stereotypical Christian is a Trump voter, is a anti-progressive, you could say, something like that, stands in the way of social justice. Very conservative aspect. And that's not necessarily true. I could see maybe some arguments, but how it's become intertwined with politics, that's not biblical at all. There's jokes about it. It's like the Republican Jesus, right? Like that's absurd.
Yeah, no, it's definitely that way. And it's really always been that way down here in the South where I live. For me, it's definitely always been that way. And yeah, I've seen firsthand, just growing up in the South in the 90s, how the Bible was used to oppress people. And yeah, and that's so unfortunate because, like, in my opinion, that's just like not what the Bible is about. It's not about oppressing anyone, but again, people associate Christianity with Christians rather than Christ, and that's extremely unfortunate. I used to do the same thing though, so I totally get it. Yeah, but anyway.
Well, and going off too, like I heard a pastor say this one time, and it was a pretty good analogy, and I think it's a good way to keep Christianity sort of keep it in mind when dealing with Christians. Is that it's like if you're a baseball fan, right? And you see, you're a fan of the Yankees, but then you go to the game and you see a Yankee fan, starting trouble, throwing hot dogs, throwing pop everywhere at everybody. You wouldn't start hating the Yankees. You would just say that fan is an idiot. You wouldn't start criticizing the team. And that's sort of how I like to think of it too. Is that with Christianity, humans they do all sorts of really, really bad things, and no matter what ideology it is, the teachings over time get lost. I think that's the main thing, and the Bible can be interpreted a lot of ways, and I think that to judge humans who are inherently selfish and self-absorbed based on a philosophy is, I think, sort of wrong-headed. And not that it might not have a point, and that's sort of it. But there's a lot in the Bible that can be used the other way too. It's like when you look at social justice, I even did it too. I would say, oh well, the Bible tolerates slavery, but there was many, many, many abolitionists that used the Bible to say no, slavery's wrong. It's Jesus said, treat others the way you want to be treated. That's the most important thing. And
Exodus,
right? Yeah, like Harriet Tubman. Yeah, she got called Moses.
I've heard that in slavery times here in the United States that a lot of so-called slave masters would actually remove the story of Moses out of the Bible so that the slaves wouldn't get any ideas about liberation and freedom.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing. There's, it's not exactly, it's like when I read one article and it's like the reason that it came to war eventually is because the Bible's not exactly clear on the issue. You could argue that it's, I wouldn't say it's pro-slavery. I think that's a big stretch, but I think that, I talked about that in my book too, about like, Jesus sort of contextualized the whole thing, like with divorce. Like, it's like a lot of people say like, oh, well, God says slavery is okay. God says meat is okay. God says divorce is okay. And it's like Jesus disrupted that entire argument with the Pharisees asked him, why did God tell us that we can divorce our wives? And Jesus said, it's because of your hardness of heart. And so with that, he's saying, it's not the ideal. He tolerates it because you are not living by the ideal. And so in order to best control the situation, divorce is sometimes the only solution. But it's not something, it's the same thing with meat too. From the beginning, it was not so. He said about divorce. Same thing with meat. It's like just because meat might have been acceptable in a certain context, that doesn't mean that God is okay with it all the time, 100% of the time. It's cool. It's like if you look at both poles of creation, there is no meat. And that's the ideal that we have to strive toward. And same thing with divorce too. If some Christian said, "Oh, well, God says I can divorce," yeah, everybody would look at them with two heads. That's absurd.
Yeah. I think the Bible, and it depends on the lens you read it with, and so much of the Bible depends on context. I mean, context is huge when you're talking about the Bible, in my opinion. And I think the Bible is very much, in a lot of instances about, liberation, freedom, acceptance, treating others the way you would want to be treated, no matter who they are. And I hope that other people can take that away from the Bible as well. But what do you think God thinks about the state of the world right now and how humans treat animals? Like, what do you think that, regardless of what the Bible says, I don't think there's any way he can be happy with this, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, it's like I actually was talking to a good friend of my father-in-law. My father-in-law is a pastor, and he's vegan as well. I don't want to say it was all me but I was probably one of the seeds that planted it. But he has a friend that's been working in animal welfare, animal rights related issues for a long time, and he eats meat and stuff, but he's sympathetic to the cause. But he was like, he had a really good statement, and he was like, yeah, he wrote a book, but he condemned factory farming in it. But the whole thing with factory farming, he was like, yeah, a lot of the curses that we're seeing, those are from God because of the way we're treating animals, because of factory farming. It's like antibiotic resistance, global warming. I don't want to say that, God sits up there and smites people or, based on curses, but I think that it's sort of built in that way. It's like, obviously if you feed animals tons of antibiotics to manage their squalid conditions, obviously it's going to create antibiotic resistance. It's going to come with all these different problems. And then there's climate change. I mean, that's becoming a huge issue. I mean, it's been a huge issue. You have these pools of methane producing manure just sitting down in North Carolina. Yeah, I'm sure you know about that. Yeah, and so it's all these issues. It's like, it's just common sense. And of course God's not okay with that. And then there's lines all throughout the Bible about, polluting the land. That's definitely something that animal agriculture's turned into.
Yeah, I think if nothing else, like even let's just say for a second that God does not care about animals at all, which I do not think is true, but let's just say for a second, we're supposed to be stewards of the planet. Like, this is our, temporary home, and it'll be supposed to be the temporary home of, future generations. And, we're just destroying it. And then, what happens to humans in these industries, like I mentioned before, like the slaughterhouse workers that are, so exploited and everything else, and they become sick. And these poor communities where the slaughterhouses, they move into these poor communities of color often to take advantage of them, because, they know they don't have enough money for a lawsuit, or, and a lot of times they don't even have enough money to move away.
Exploitation of the poor.
Yeah, it's so exploitive. And yeah, just off of that alone, I think you could argue that God's upset, but I think God's upset about, killing all these animals as well, is so unnecessary.
Yeah, and what I always say too is, like, there's one verse that completely condemns factory farming and all of its abuses, is Proverbs 12:10. The righteous man cares for animals, the wicked man is cruel. It's like, just based on that alone, that condemns 95 to 99% of meat in this country and probably all over the world. That there's the biblical writers, if that existed at the time, there's no way that they would have ever tolerated meat. There's just nothing like that even came close to existing at that time. It's like, I always talk about too, like what you were saying with context too. People in biblical times, meat was historically the food of the rich. Like, people in biblical times, they ate meat like maybe, anywhere between 3 and 10 times a year. It wasn't like an everyday thing. And I would say people in biblical times at most ate meat 3 times a month. In America, we eat it 3 times a day. and we're seeing that too that's another aspect too, is the health aspects of it too. I mean, we've historically never even come close to eating the amount of meat that we do today. I mean, I was reading the latest thing. I think it was 272 pounds of meat per American. And, in biblical times, what do they eat? Maybe at most 8 to 10 pounds a year. I mean, that's 300 times what they would would today, or maybe more than that. Yeah, whatever the math is. But it's that's another thing too, is it wasn't a regular menu item. And they actually would talk about that in the Bible too. Like, it was the kosher laws. That was a big thing about, like, restricting meat consumption, and you won't get the diseases from Egypt, they would call that, and that was because of the frequent consumption of animal products.
I was listening to somebody's. It might have maybe even been you. I can't remember who it was, but I was listening to somebody talk about how there was a set of commandments before the 10 Commandments that we know that was destroyed, apparently because maybe society was not ready for those commandments at the time. Just kind of like what we were talking about, like God's very begrudgingly working within how terrible humans are. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. Like, he's working within our, like, barbaric guidelines. I don't know, but yeah. And then maybe, for lack of a better term, like, dumbed it down with the commandments that we have now. It makes me wonder what those original commandments said, and maybe if they said anything about animals. Obviously that's all, like, speculation. I guess we'll never know, but
yeah, it's a good question. And I think I could be wrong. I'm not exactly, there's a lot of deconstructors of the Bible too. Like, I've got a lot of friends that do work in that. I'm not particularly familiar with a lot of it, but I think it was the 10 Commandments that were similar to, like, the Code of Hammurabi, I think it was called. And so that might be what you're talking about as well. But on that subject, actually, though, I always talk about, there's a big application about it. The 10 Commandments valid for Christians today. And yeah, like in 2 Corinthians, I think it's 3:6, Paul talks about letter of the law versus spirit of the law. That's what I was talking about too with the 10 Commandments, is a lot of, we'll talk about, like, what's the validity of the 10 Commandments to the Christian today. And there's a big thing in the New Testament, it talks about the spirit of the verse. And so, you read the Old Testament, and, that a lot of that is just terrible for animals, because you think, well, it says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's ass or thy neighbor's donkey. And so, a lot of it is animals as property. But Paul talked about the difference between the letter and the spirit. When you read the letter of the law, that means just, what's plainly written. But if you apply the principle, the spirit of the verse, what does that mean? And we do it all the time, actually, in the Bible, and we don't even talk about it. Like, for instance, a lot of people talk about, I don't know if there's anything in particular in the Bible about, like, people with disabilities. Like, obviously, I don't think that they had real sophisticated wheelchairs or anything back then, but like a spirit of the law thing I always hear about is, in the Bible it says, don't put a stone before a blind person and, like, make them fall on purpose. Like, that's obviously sinful. And, if you talk to, like, a disability organization, they would apply that to, don't put a set of stairs for a wheelchair person to go down. Or, the principle of that is don't make life more difficult for disabled people and try to make disabled people's lives easier. And then when you apply that to the Old Testament, it's like, thou shalt not kill, right? That's the famous law. And, there's a lot of different, who does that apply to? Obviously it was humans, because it didn't apply to animals, because God's telling them to sacrifice animals. But when Paul said the spirit of the law, why does that not apply to animals now? That's applying the principle of thou shalt not kill. And you could certainly argue that's God's ideal. And then all the way down too, thou shalt not steal. What do we do to animals all the time with eggs and milk? I mean, that's theft.
Gluttony as well. What's more gluttonous than, making workers suffer, making animals suffer just for this, 5 minutes of taste pleasure,
Yeah, in the name of gluttony. That's also a good. That's actually another thing I focused a lot in my book. You might be familiar with the desert quail story.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really interesting. Yeah, and it's funny too how much that gets drowned out too. Like, because a lot of people will be like, "Oh, well, that was talking about, like, the Israelites being ungrateful." It's like,
can you set that up for people who don't know about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and it's interesting when you kind of have to put it in context of what the rest of the Bible says. But it's like in Eden, God says, "Eat only the plants." That's the ideal. This is very good. And then and then in the new earth also, the world becomes vegan again. But in the meantime, God, after the Exodus, he releases the Israelites from slavery, and he's feeding them this bread in the desert. It's like this bread from heaven. It's called manna. And so they're eating it like for, I think it was like a year. He was giving it to them every day. It was this miraculous food.
They got sick of it.
Right. They started complaining and they said, oh my gosh, I wish we were back in Egypt. We had meat there. Oh my gosh, we want meat so bad. Why can't we have meat? So then God gets mad and says, okay, I'm going to give you meat, but it's going to be coming out of your nostrils. So then he gives them meat. The ones that eat it die from a plague. And so, and that's what I was saying. Like a lot of Christians, actually their graves were called, or their tombs were called the graves of gluttony. That's a massive part of it too. Is that
very telling?
Right. And then obviously when you put that next to Eden and the new earth, it's like God's obviously not happy with meat consumption. That's clearly a teaching of that, and it's just funny too because a lot of Christians, they'll drown that out and be like, oh well, no, that was like the Israelites being ungrateful. It's like, okay, yes, but what does it obviously entail? They didn't need to eat meat. They ate meat, and then look what happened. They died from a plague, and I connect that too all the time with. Again, I don't want to make it out like God is smiting people, but it's like. With like COVID or, pretty much every major infection that's come out of, like, for instance, it's amazing how much we don't talk about it, but like the swine flu, that obviously came from a hog farm. I think it was in North Carolina, actually.
North Carolina, yeah. They try to blame it on Mexico, but North Carolina.
Yeah, it had genetics from both, but it was definitely, the Americans don't like to hear that, but it's, it was from a hog farm, right? But that's what I always say too, is, if you look at all of the pandemics that are across the world, that generate, good chance are they came from an animal. I mean, that's a pretty fundamental precept, and that's sort of always how it's worked too. I mean, like when HIV came on the scene back in the 80s. I mean, they found samples of that back in the 50s, and they narrowed it down to it was probably from bushmeat, and it was from people butchering chimpanzees and eating them for meat. And I don't know what people had to do to survive, so I'm not judging that, but generally, the more that we exploit animals, the more likely we're exposing ourselves to potential infections. And that's, I mean, they haven't, it's all but, it's not confirmed yet, but I think that's the case with COVID. I mean, just because that's the track record. It would be unprecedented for it to be anything else.
Yeah, I mean, any zoonotic disease pretty much, like HIV, SARS, MERS, swine flu, bird flu, mad cow disease. Yeah, all those are just based on, humans just can't let animals live their lives, can't leave animals alone. We gotta... and like you said, there might be some instances of survival, and I don't judge that either. It's different, but
there's a common link to all of it.
Yeah. So, switching gears, I wanted to ask you a question that I think a lot of people have. I think a lot of even non-vegans have this question because they think about it when it comes to their dogs or their cats or their companion animals. Do you think that animals have souls?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I get that one actually all the time. The Bible's not exactly clear on that. I know I talked about that in the book. I Will Abolish the Bow. There's a big long section on that. It's not exactly clear. Now, like when you look at the end times, obviously, Isaiah 11:6-9, Isaiah 65:25, Zechariah 2:4-5, they all talk about animals being present on the new earth. That's actually a big misconception too that we have is like, what exactly is meant by a soul? And I think one of the biggest things, and even I didn't know this actually, but from a Christian perspective, a lot of us think that heaven is just like this place up in the sky that you go to when you die. And that has some validity, but a lot of it's because of our culture. We think that like, it's like how many movies like you see, it's like, oh, he's reached the pearly gates and he sees St. Peter and all this other stuff.
Bro, you didn't watch Touched by an Angel growing up?
I've been hearing so much about that show lately, actually. It's so funny.
My grandparents used to watch that all the time. That's how it is, right? Touched by an Angel.
Right. Yeah, that's the and in the Bible it talks about, heaven is this place, it's this realm that's beyond our understanding and that you go to. That's called the intermediate state or the intermediate heaven, I guess we would call it. But the heaven, the ultimate heaven, I guess we would say, it's the new earth. It's where Jesus comes back and then establishes the eternal paradise and then creates Eden all over again. That's like what heaven is in its truest form. Basically, he brings what's heaven and brings it down to earth. Yeah, and that's like the whole concept of it. And so when you look at that, there's all these different descriptions of animals being there. The wolf will lay with the lamb, these heavenly states. And then also there's a lot of animals in heaven right now. Like I think it's Revelation 5:13. It says every creature in heaven was singing. There's mention of like, I think it's Revelation 8. It talks about an eagle being there. So there's like these different dimensions of like, okay, animals are in heaven. They're going to be on the new earth. And so why would they not have souls then?
I think they have to. I think they have to by default, just from everything you said.
Right, exactly. It would just make, and the other argument that I've heard, like one famous author, he talked about, is there a possibility that they're recreated animals? But that really wouldn't make any sense either, because why would God recreate, it doesn't recreate humans in heaven, so why would he recreate animals in heaven?
At that point, they maybe would be like a machine, like you initially thought once upon a time.
Right, yeah. Before I was enlightened.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's also there's some scriptural evidence, though, too. Like I know in Ecclesiastes, it says, who knows whether the spirit of the animal goes down and the spirit of the human goes up? And then it leaves it as a question. And then in Ecclesiastes, I think it's 12, it says the spirit returns to God. And so is that saying that both human and animal spirit goes to God? So there's these questions about it that there's some and then also, like, I think it's Psalm 36:6. It says, Lord, you save animal and beast. And so it's like this sort of like, okay, you save both animal and beast. And then the other big one too is it's in I think it's Luke 2 or 4. It's all flesh will see salvation. And it's interesting that they chose that word, because a lot of people, like a lot of translations, it'll say all people will see salvation, but that doesn't make any sense. Why would it say all flesh? And so I think that's what it's saying, is that animals will see salvation as well.
I certainly hope they have souls, and I think that they do. It'd be pretty hard to convince me otherwise, but
I agree. I mean, it doesn't explicitly say, but I think there's more than enough evidence to declare that they do.
Well, from everything that humans put them through here, I certainly hope that, they're in heaven and getting to enjoy that life.
Absolutely.
So you talked about it a little bit, and I'm going to ask you even more about your book. I know we hadn't even talked about it yet, but I promise I'll get there. Tell us about New Earth Abolition. That's something that you wrote a lot about in your book, I Will Abolish the Bow. Just tell us about the concept of New Earth Abolition, what that's all about.
Well, the origin of it, actually, it was, I'd read a lot of Andrew Lindsay stuff. I read a lot of different ideas about what does animal rights mean from a Christian perspective. And the thing I kept running into is, like, people would ask me, like, well, what do humans owe animals? Like, it was sort of an administrative issue. Like, it was like, okay, you're saying that animals deserve rights, but what are those rights? So I didn't really have anything, for instance, Andrew Lindsay came up with theos rights, which was basically that, you might have read this before, but it's basically like God created animals belong to God, and so what belongs to God needs to be treated with respect. And that's all well and good. There's no opposition to that, but it wasn't like, how do I explain that to someone? Like, how do I translate that to how do I treat animals?
Yeah, it's kind of like treat animals well on a technicality, not because they deserve it. It's like not really all the way there for me.
Right, that's kind of what I kept facing too, is like, okay, so what? Okay, that's all well and good. I treat them with respect, but what does respect mean even? What does that entail me? And so that's when I came up with, what would be the best way to, for instance, like Isaiah 11:6. I mention that verse a lot, but it's so important. But it says, the wolf will lay with the lamb, the lion will lay with the ox, or eat straw like the ox. And then it says, a little child shall take care of them, or a little child will lead them, depending on the translation. It basically means that they're going to care for the animals. And so that's God's kingdom in its fullest, is that we become caretakers to the animals. That was always the intention in Eden as well. And that's the whole friendship thing is, they're not to be exploited. They're friends that we take care of. And it's like Andrew Lindsay said too, is, a lot of people say, well, animals were put here to serve humans. No, it's the other way around. Jesus said, be the servant of all, or the ruler becomes the servant. That's how God's kingdom works, is the one who has the most power is the one who serves. And that was sort of what I was going for too, is, you see this picture in Isaiah 11:6 of a child caring for the animals. That's really our true job. That's God's kingdom at its fullest. But how do we get there? How do I serve the animals? And so I said that was the main things with New Earth Abolition was, most importantly, we think about equality. It's like Matthew 7:12. Jesus states, treat others the way you want to be treated. That's most important. Second is servanthood. Like I said, Jesus said, be the servant of all. And so we have to think about with our actions with animals, we always have to be serving them. It has to be, they have a vested interest in not being harmed. And so we're serving them. We're not to exploit them, we're to serve them. That's the idea. And then the third tenet is harmony. And it's like, in God's kingdom in the fullest, Isaiah 11:6, again, the child will take care of the animals. The wolf will lay with the lamb. And so we're always trying to demonstrate harmony between humans and animals, and also animals between animals as well. I get into that, like how, like one way we can prevent a lot of harm is to consider like vegan dog food, something like that. Like we're not making another species suffer because we're taking care of this animal. That really wouldn't jive with NEA, because it's like, we're making another animal suffer to serve another animal. We're applicable, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that passage in Isaiah means a ton to me. It gives me so much like inspiration and hope to think about that world where, animals don't even harm each other, because, in Eden, that's the way it originally was before the fall of man. I don't know if you've seen my tattoo, man, but that's what this tattoo is.
Oh, wow. That's really cool. I never knew you had that, actually.
Yeah, I've only had it for about a year. Sorry to those listening in your car at home, you can't see my tattoo, but
my wife actually, I have to show you. My wife actually has 11:6-9 and 65:25 on her back.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, you have the same tattoo, which is like beyond cool.
Yeah. That series of verses right there means a lot.
Same.
So like I was just mentioning, like in Eden, animals didn't eat each other. God's ideal was, giving plants for everyone to eat. That's Genesis 1:29. You could call it, even though the word didn't exist back then, you could call it a vegan world, Eden. So how do we get back to that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think especially from a Christian perspective, that was sort of what I was writing New Earth Abolition for, was sort of how do we get back to Eden, or Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That was sort of the explanation, and that was what I went with for too. Is we always look at animals and with their consideration in mind, every decision that we make towards animals, we have to think about, is this serving them, and is it how we would want to be treated if we were in their situation? And that's what I went off of on a Christian perspective. And also, is this making a more harmonious and fruitful relationship between our species and all species, really? And also, of course, that entails veganism. And then I talk about in the book, too, choosing cruelty-free products. That's incredibly important, too. I mean, there's countless animals killed every year by the millions of just testing on them for legality purposes. It's not really benefiting anybody. And then there's also, obviously, animals and entertainment. That's not something that's ever even a question in the Bible. Like the obvious of circuses, bullfighting, things like that. That obviously didn't happen in Eden. And then the last one was, fur, obviously. Yeah, that's another one. That's fashion. Cruelty-free fashion is incredibly important as well.
Tell us about your book, I Will Abolish the Bow. We've actually talked today about, some of the stuff that you've written about in this book. I read this book in its entirety. It's wonderful. It's very informative. It's comprehensive. I think that it's a good read for non-Christians who, that are vegans and, maybe have a hard time convincing their Christian family or Christian friends, or it's just, I think it's obviously good for Christian vegans to just kind of strengthen what they already know. I would recommend this book for anybody, really. Can you just tell us more about it?
Absolutely, yeah, and well, chapter 1 I sort of focus on. Just a real quick summary of it, but chapter 1 is sort of a, where has Christianity gone wrong? And that was sort of where the book started. And I was sort of, realizing that Christianity had failed miserably with animal rights, especially recently and in the past, more so recently. And then chapter 2, I start to get into, how do we view animals and where have we been wrong-headed on it? And that's where I got to Nefesh Haya. That was sort of the viewing animals for their intrinsic quality that we've sort of skipped over completely. And then chapter 3 is, what does dominion mean? That's incredibly important. And how do we view dominion? And then with dominion came New Earth Abolition. That's obviously how we should treat animals in the fullness of the kingdom. And in Eden, that was the intention. And then I also get into, after New Earth Abolition, I talk a lot about domesticated animals and what is their place in the world if everybody was to be vegan? What is their place? And that's where my book sort of differs on a lot of animal rights stuff. Is like, I noticed a lot of animal rights stuff is sort of, how do I put this? A lot of secular animal rights stuff is very callous towards domesticated animals. Like, for instance, like Gary Francione, I know he's one that advocates for, I don't want to say extinction, but that domesticated animals shouldn't exist. And there's not really an argument for that in the Bible, because he basically made all of the animals domesticated. That was sort of the indication at the beginning, was God creates the animals and says, humans, take care of them. That's your dominion, is to take care of them. And so the relationship that humans have with dogs and cats, that's the relationship with humans are supposed to have with all animals, actually. And so that was something I felt was sort of calloused, because I would never want someone to think like, oh, this relationship I have with a dog or a cat where I love them, they're the equivalent of my child, essentially, that, that I care for them, I love them. That's never something that I wanted to condemn with my animal rights focus. And so I talk about, what's a relationship where humans could have with domesticated animals where they can continue to live on beyond having to exploit them. Like people will say, you know it too, like with Carnus, they'll say like, oh, all these animals would be extinct if we didn't have them. It's like, first of all, it's just a bad reason, but also they can exist just for the sake of existing. And it's like I said, they're not here for us, we're here for them. And so that was sort of the idea of that. And then later on in the book, chapter 6, I know I get into a lot of things with Christianity and its failures with social justice in the past. Like I talk about how I know it did a really good job with civil rights. Like Martin Luther King obviously was a pastor. Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor. He dealt a lot with civil rights. But then I talked about how, I don't want animal rights to become a place where Christianity fails at, like it did, not completely fails at, but fails at with slavery, fails with the way it treated women. Christianity became a major stumbling block to women's equality. And it still is. It's still a big problem within the church, is how we view women collectively. And then I was talking about how animal rights, it's sort of the same deal, is that Christianity impedes animal rights when it really doesn't need to. There's plenty of good arguments for animal rights from the Bible. And then later on that, I talk about what the Bible has to say about speciesism. That was pretty important. And I took that actually from a lot of different publications about racism. Like there's a lot of things in there about God shows no partiality. And so how does that apply to us, where people say, oh, well, humans get my concern, but not animals. It's like, well, no, God doesn't think that. That's not a godly thing to say. That's a human superiority complex. And then chapter 8 through 10, I get into like frequently asked questions. Like I know one was like questions about the afterlife, like souls. Chapter 8, I think, was about, I think it was about Jesus, actually. Questions about Jesus, like why did he eat meat, or why did he feed them fish? And I think chapter 10 was questions about NEA and also New Earth Abolition, questions about, where there might be holes with that or expected holes. And then also I wanted to, and you can buy the book on whiffandstock.com too. I want to let everybody know. That book's been available since I think it's July 2021, but it's been, I've heard a lot of good things about it. It's angered a lot of people too, so that's been a marker for success for me.
Yeah, you're not doing it right if you haven't pissed somebody off, dude.
I'm glad you said it that way, because that's what I was thinking.
Well, yeah, I highly recommend, for what it's worth, that everybody get a copy of this book. It's so good. It's so comprehensive. I also want to plug a panel talk that Matthew and I were both a part of a couple of years ago. It was when COVID was, first becoming a reality, and we were locked down, and Matthew and some other Christian vegan friends were on a panel that I moderated, and we dive really deep into some of these, Christian vegan questions. I'm going to link that in the description below, as well as Matthew's book, I Will Abolish the Bow. Matthew, is there anything you want to say before we wrap up? And also, do you have any advice for any animal rights activists out there?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, the one thing I wanted to say too, so my next book, I think I mentioned the title earlier, but it's due for publication in summer 2023 is The Hopeful. But I wanted to let everybody know too that some of the concepts in I Will Abolish the Bow, I expand on them, like where I think I dismissed some things too easily. Like for instance, the whole thing about the Book of Acts, it's that thing about the Peter's vision of the sheet of animals. I sort of dismissed that too quickly as like abolishing the kosher laws. And then I've studied actually the kosher laws a lot, like in the last year, and what their meaning was and what they've traditionally been understood as. And then I actually make an argument that the kosher laws are still in effect for Christians, which is incredibly important actually, because I think I glossed over those too easily in the last book. So you'll see a lot more of that in the next book. And then I also tackle a little bit on, well, actually a lot in the next book on sort of deconstructing the Bible about, like, for instance, I talk about like Jesus fed fish. Why? And this book talks about how some of that actually might be later additions. Like you've probably read it, Trey, like about how there's mention about the early church fathers. They talk about the miracle of the feeding the 5,000, but they don't mention the fish at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of controversy around this.
Right. And so I sort of, I would say I Will Abolish the Bow. It's me taking the Bible at face value. And then this book is more about deconstructing it and saying, this might not be a legitimate thing. And so we have to take that into account as well, is that, Jesus may have fed them with the fish. If he did, here's why, but he might not have. And so that's a little bit of an expanse on that. And then the other thing I want to say too is with the kosher law studying, I've been reading up a lot on Seventh-day Adventists. And that was another thing I wanted to mention too, is that they've been really helpful in my journey as well. And they're not exactly animal rights focused, but the fact that they're they advocate, they believe kosher is still in effect for Christians, which I actually didn't think that was a solid argument. And the more I read it, I was like, I think they're absolutely right, actually. Because a lot of the things that we traditionally interpret as getting rid of the kosher laws are actually taken out of context. So you'll see that in my next book, obviously. But the Seventh-day Adventists, they have a really good, they teach that vegetarianism is God's ideal, which I think is appropriate, but they try to tell their churchgoers that you have to be kosher and try to be vegetarian. And so I think like 40 to 60% of their, church-going audience is vegan or vegetarian. And I know I actually first found out about them from Desmond Doss. He was a World War II soldier. They made a movie about his life actually called Hacksaw Ridge. You might be familiar with it.
Is that the Andrew Garfield movie?
Yep, that's the one.
Yeah, I saw that a long time ago.
Yeah, fantastic. It's one of my favorite movies, actually. But he was a Seventh-day Adventist, vegetarian, and then also was strictly against guns as well. And so he didn't carry a gun while he was a medic. Incredible story. But that's how I found out about SDAs. And a lot of them are vegan and vegetarian. And Ellen G. White actually had a quote, something like, by eating meat, we drown out our compassion towards our fellow creatures. And I think there's something to that as well. Like, obviously it's not from the Bible, but her statement, I think that's very clear, is that, a lot of the problems we have in the world is because we're disrespecting animals, and then we end up disrespecting each other because of that as well. It makes us very callous towards the suffering of others. And you can see that. The fruit of the Seventh-day Adventists, a lot of them are vegetarian, and a lot of them are very social justice focused. And so...
yeah, I mean, imagine if we, were brought up to... learn about treating ants with respect. If we treated ants and spiders and moths and slugs and caterpillars, with respect, maybe we would learn to respect our fellow humans, which, seems beyond some people. It's 2022 and some people don't even respect each other, human-wise. Something about the Seventh-day Adventists I want to throw out there too. Mm-hmm. For any animal rights activists out there that ever go to jail, tell them you're a Seventh-day Adventist. You'll have better luck with getting vegan food potentially.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, it's a religious obligation, right? It's constitutional, right? And but that's what I was going to say too. Is not exactly. I don't attend a Seventh-day Adventist church, but I know if any activists are out there and they're struggling with connecting with groups, SDA is probably your best bet, because they're generally more respectful of animals just because they teach a vegetarian diet. They're very much Eden and New Earth focused.
Definitely. All right. Wrap us up with what advice you have for animal rights activists out there, other than the tidbit I just gave about jail, which hopefully doesn't happen to anybody listening here.
Well, most of it is, give yourself a pat on the back, I think, is the main thing, is because we live in a world that, doesn't value others' lives, especially animals. And, I tell people all the time, they'll say, like, what can I do to help help animals' lives be better? And I'm always say, hey, the fact that you even connected the fact that animals are suffering and that you did something about it says a lot about your character and also about what you're doing. Because, the vast majority of people, they see it and they just keep walking. And so the fact that you even made the connection says something good about yourself. And then also the other thing too is, never feel afraid about speaking up either. Like I know a lot of people, they struggle with, what do I do in my activism? And what I always say is, take it one day at a time. And then also anytime you get an opportunity, always try to take it. Like, for instance, like every day, even if it's just something small, like because I'm always like arguing with carnists on Facebook. I think that's actually how we met.
Yeah, I think so.
I remember I was talking to you on Facebook and you were getting like a lot of carnist Christians on your Facebook. And I was like, oh man, this guy's getting hit. And I know, like, I'll see ads every day and I'll just plug in something like, hey, would you do this to a dog? Or, just a simple comment. You might get backlash, but you can even turn the comments on. The fact that you're saying something means something. And every little movement that you make is a helpful act.
Yeah, most definitely. That was going to be my last question, but I just realized that I didn't even ask you about the Christian Animal Rights Association. So let's talk about that real quick before we go. Can you just talk about that and what that is and what kind of a resource it can be for people?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Christian Animal Rights Association, my wife and I formed it in 2019, actually. We had debated, I know, like between 2017 and 2019, we had like really taken a hold of the vegan message, and we were obviously focused on our faith as well. And so we were like, how can we connect our faith and veganism? And Christian Vegetarian Association, we tabled with them a lot, had a lot of good outreach with them. And then some other organizations that I was helping out. And then it sort of dawned on me. I was reading a lot of Gary Francione, very like abolitionist approach kind of stuff. And a lot of Christian organizations, they're very focused on animal welfare, which is like, they have one bad day, shoot them in the head, like as long as they like live a good life, anti-factory farming, which is good, obviously, but it wasn't enough. And I feel like it wasn't taking the logical extension. Like, if we're going to really say that like God's ideal is Eden and the new earth where there's no more animal exploitation, then we need to be abolitionist. And that really should be the focus. And so my wife and I came to the conclusion that Christian Animal Rights Association always needs to be abolitionist focused. Animal welfare is obviously better. We're not going to criticize people that are working towards that, but our end goal is to end animal exploitation not strictly, but specifically with regards to food, fashion, entertainment, and experimentation. Those four categories we're looking to abolish. That's sort of the focus. And then with that, another thing that helped us create Christian Animal Rights Association, the inspiration was a lot of Christian groups that are focused on veganism tend to do it from the human perspective. Like a lot of that I've noticed, a lot of it is focused on either health or environmental or, welfare of workers and things like that. And that's all fantastic, of course. There's nothing to be against that. But we noticed that there wasn't really an organization that was specifically working for the animals, and that was their focus. And so that was the main thing we wanted to do, is we wanted to create an organization where, if it helps humans, great, but it's mostly looked at as a side effect. The reason that we should get rid of animal agriculture is because God wants it, but also because the animals need us. That's always the focus, is the animals.
Well, I'm so glad that you and your wife, Nina, set up that organization. I think it's much needed. I was very happy when I found out about it. I was very happy when we met because you don't meet too many fellow Christian vegans out there. I appreciate you. You're a wealth of knowledge. Matthew's somebody I go to when I'm thinking about Christianity and veganism and how they go together. And if I've got questions or if I've been thinking about something, Matthew's somebody I go to, and I appreciate you being that person. I appreciate everything that you do, man, and I really appreciate you being on the show today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Trey. And you're really easy to talk to, and I admire your work. And thanks so much for having me today. And of course, Wally too. He was the true guest.
Yeah. Wally has joined his sisters outside, but I will let him know that you were excited to meet him through Zoom.
Absolutely. Yeah, let him know. Christian Animal Rights Association too. We're working for him, so no problem.
Yeah, I'll let him know.
All right. Sounds good, Trey. Thanks so much.
Matthew's just incredible. I hope no matter what background you're coming from on this, what lens you're viewing this topic from, I hope that you were able to gain some knowledge that will be helpful for you from this episode. Just a reminder, I'm going to be linking some stuff in the show notes, like where you can find Christian Animal Rights Association, where you can find Matthew's book, I Will Abolish the Bow, and I'm also going to link a panel discussion that I mentioned in the podcast. It was a panel discussion that we did a couple of years ago where Matthew and some other vegan Christian friends are really providing a lot of knowledge for those that want to really do a deep dive into this topic. We appreciate you listening. Please rate and review the podcast. It helps others find it more easily, and the more people that find it, the more people can be inspired by the guests interviewed on our show and turn that into actionable change for the animals. If you enjoy the Animal Liberation Hour and would like to support our work at Animal Activism Mentorship, please consider joining our Patreon for as little as $2 a month if you're able to do so. This goes such a long way in helping us grow the animal rights movement through mentorship. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship, where you can keep up with the podcast as well as everything AAM. One more reminder that you can sign up for a free mentor to help you with your activism at animalactivismmentorship.com. If you needed a sign that you should be an activist for the animals, this is it. Remember that it will take all of us to achieve animal liberation. So stay focused, stay positive, be effective, and keep doing your part. Until next time.